In 1858, people believed a machine would destroy human intimacy, poison truth faster than it could be corrected, and let strangers control their minds from hundreds of miles away. In 1994, they said eerily similar things about the internet. The technology was different, but the terror was functionally identical. This isn't coincidence. It's a pattern where human responses to pivotal moments echo across time with such precision, it suggests something far deeper than mere repetition. The phenomenon reveals itself in the archived letters, newspaper editorials, and personal diaries from both eras, documents now preserved in the Library of Congress and Stanford University's digital collections. In 1846, editorials in publications like the London Times warned that the telegraph would replace human presence with wires and genuine community with cold, mechanical efficiency. Fast forward to 1995, and Newsweek's infamous headline declared nearly identical fears. The internet? Bah! It will isolate us from real human contact. But the parallels run darker than simple technophobia. In both periods, societies experienced the same progression of collective anxiety. First came the wonder. The telegraph's first message in 1844, "What hath God wrought?" mirrored the breathless optimism of early internet adopters in the late 1980s who believed they were witnessing the birth of a utopian information age. Then came the disillusionment. By the 1850s, telegraph operators reported being overwhelmed by false information, scams, and what they called wire fraud, the same panic wearing a different mask when email phishing exploded in the late 1990s. The most chilling parallel? The fear of invisible compulsion. In the 1860s, Boston physician Dr. George Miller documented cases of what he termed neurasthenia linked to telegraph use. Patients arriving at his practice describing anxiety, compulsion, exhaustion, and a profound loss of agency they couldn't explain. His clinical notes, preserved in 19th century medical archives, describe symptoms in handwriting that grew increasingly urgent: the inability to stop checking for messages, the dread of disconnection, the sensation of being trapped by an invisible technological force. These psychologically equivalent symptoms reappeared in research journals after 2010, studied under terms like internet addiction disorder and digital dependency. The same story, rebooted. Victorian-era sermons warned that the telegraph would allow the devil's whispers to travel at lightning speed, corrupting youth and destroying traditional family structures. In 1999, religious leaders used strikingly similar rhetoric about the internet's moral dangers. A woman writing in her diary in 1867 described her fear that the telegraph was stealing her son's mind, that he would rush to the telegraph office before speaking to his own family. In 2003, a mother in Ohio told a local newspaper the internet had stolen her daughter's soul. The words change slightly across centuries, but the fundamental human fear that connection might actually mean disconnection, that progress might be destruction in disguise, remains hauntingly constant. And what these patterns reveal next is far more disturbing than panic. On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., San Francisco photographer Arnold Genth stumbled into the street and watched his city collapse into rubble, later describing in his writings how survivors moved through the ruins in a state of shock, unable to comprehend that yesterday's world no longer existed. On March 11, 2020, as Italy entered its first COVID-19 lockdown, posts from Milan residents captured strikingly similar sentiments: the feeling of being ghosts walking through a world that had ended overnight. Two catastrophes, 114 years apart, one geological and one biological, yet the human responses were so perfectly mirrored that reading the accounts side by side feels like looking into a temporal echo that shouldn't be possible. The archival records reveal something deeply unsettling about how humans process collective trauma. In the immediate aftermath of the 1906 earthquake, survivors described a phenomenon psychologists later termed disaster euphoria, a strange, almost inappropriate sense of community and purpose that emerged from the chaos.
The San Francisco Chronicle reported on April 20, 1906, in ink still smudged from the makeshift printing presses, that neighbors who had never spoken were sharing food, strangers were opening their homes, and a bizarre optimism pervaded the refugee camps despite the ash and rubble. Survivors walked through streets that still smelled like smoke, stepping over bricks that had been bedrooms the day before, yet somehow finding hope in shared loss. Dr. Edward Devine, who coordinated relief efforts, wrote in his official report, "I have never witnessed such spontaneous kindness between people who, just days before, would have passed each other without acknowledgement." Fast forward to March and April 2020, and social scientists documented psychologically equivalent phenomena during early pandemic lockdowns. Research published in the Journal of Community Psychology during 2020 documented widespread reports of unexpected community connection despite physical isolation, the same disaster euphoria pattern recorded in 1906. A teacher in Rome posted video of her entire apartment building singing from their balconies, writing, "We have never been closer while being so far apart." A relief worker in San Francisco had recorded in 1906, "The fire has brought us together in ways prosperity never could." Videos of Italians singing, mutual aid networks exploding across cities, strangers delivering groceries to the elderly. The patterns were functionally identical to those documented in 1906 San Francisco, down to the psychological terminology researchers used to describe them. But the darker parallels are more disturbing. Both disasters triggered predictable responses of scapegoating and blame. In 1906, minority communities, especially Chinese residents already facing discrimination, were blamed for hampering rescue efforts and accused of looting, leading to targeted violence documented in contemporary police records and newspapers. In 2020, Asian communities worldwide faced eerily similar accusations, with documented dramatic spikes in anti-Asian hate crimes and harassment. The need to assign blame to the other during incomprehensible crisis manifested across the century gap with mechanical precision. Most chilling of all are the parallel narratives of false recovery. By May 1906, San Francisco newspapers were publishing triumphant stories about the city's resilience, even as thousands remained homeless and traumatized. In May 2020, headlines prematurely declared we were returning to normal, while morgues overflowed. The human need to believe the nightmare has ended, even when it demonstrably hasn't, repeated itself with algorithmic predictability. But this pattern goes deeper than disaster psychology. It reaches into the very structure of human rebellion. In March 1834, a young mill worker named Harriet Hanson Robinson joined 2,000 female factory workers in protest. Later writing in her memoir about their collective conviction, they refused to be silenced by those profiting from their labor, recognizing themselves as the human machinery that built industrial wealth, machinery that could grind to a halt until justice turned in their favor. On September 20, 2019, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg stood before the United Nations and declared, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth." Two women, 185 years apart, using the same moral language, separated by centuries, and the crowds responded with psychologically equivalent fervor. The archival evidence of these parallel revolutionary moments is staggering. The Lowell Mill Girls protest of 1834, documented in archives at the American Textile History Museum, began with pamphlets distributed secretly among workers, containing phrases invoking their rights as human beings and the dignity they deserved. These pamphlets were hand-printed, passed covertly between shifts, their pages still rough with cheap paper and designed to evoke moral outrage. In 2019, climate strike organizers used social media, but analysis of the most viral protest content revealed functionally identical moral framing, appeals to their right to a future and the dignity of a livable planet. The technology changed from paper to pixels, but the psychological triggers remained hauntingly constant. Both movements faced predictable institutional dismissal. In 1834, factory owners published newspaper editorials calling the mill girls hysterical, misguided by radical elements, and too emotional to understand economic realities. The Boston Transcript suggested the protesters were young women who should return to their proper domestic roles. One mill owner wrote to a business associate, "These girls understand nothing of markets and capital. Their emotions cloud their judgment." In 2019, critics of climate activists used eerily parallel language. Greta Thunberg was called hysterical, manipulated by adult radicals, and too young to understand economic complexities. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin told her to study economics before commenting on policy. The dismissal tactics transcended centuries with almost script-like precision. But here's where the parallels become truly disturbing. Both movements succeeded in creating moral panic among those in power, documented in private correspondence that later became public. In archives of 19th century business correspondence, mill owners didn't just express concern, they expressed a specific, trembling fear that the machinery was finally waking up, that labor organizing would spread like wildfire to other industries and topple the entire economic order they'd built. One manufacturer wrote in 1835, "If this spreads, everything we have constructed will collapse." Internal documents from fossil fuel companies have expressed nearly identical anxiety about threats to existing economic structures, using language that echoes those 19th century letters with disturbing precision. The powerful, separated by nearly 2 centuries, experienced the same existential dread when confronted with organized moral outrage from those they dismissed as powerless. But why? Why do humans repeat these patterns with such eerie consistency? The answer lies in something far more fundamental than culture or learning.
In 1895, French sociologist Émile Durkheim published a concept that would haunt psychology for over a century: collective effervescence, the idea that humans experiencing the same intense social moment develop shared emotional and psychological responses that transcend individual consciousness, creating what he called a common soul. In 2011, neuroscientist Dr. Yuri Hassan at Princeton University placed test subjects in an fMRI machine while they listened to the same story and discovered something that seemed impossible. Their brain activity synchronized with such precision that he could predict one person's neural patterns by observing another's. We are not just repeating history's emotional patterns, our brains are structurally wired to experience collective moments in frighteningly similar ways, regardless of the century we're born into. Dr. Hassan's research, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, revealed that during shared narratives, listeners' brains showed neural coupling. Their prefrontal cortices, the regions responsible for processing meaning and emotional significance, fired in strikingly similar sequences. When viewed through the lens of earlier psychological theories about group responses to crises, the patterns became undeniable. Humans aren't just prone to similar reactions, we are neurologically predisposed to respond consistently to the same fundamental stimuli: technological disruption, existential threat, collective trauma, calls for justice. The implications are staggering. Anthropologist Dr. Maurice Halbwachs, who studied collective memory in the 1920s and later died in Buchenwald concentration camp in 1945, wrote in his final theories that societies tend to repeat their emotional responses because memory is not individual but social, passed down through cultural frameworks that remain largely unchanged across generations. Even facing his own death, he documented this pattern with scientific precision, theorizing that future civilizations would face the same terrors their ancestors did and respond with similar psychology, not because they were ignorant of history, but because human social memory operates on patterns
deeper than conscious knowledge. Accounts from survivors suggest that Hobvox spent his final days discussing how we are all prisoners of patterns we cannot see. Modern research in social psychology supports these predictions. Studies have found that when people are exposed to stories of historical injustice, their empathetic neural responses can mirror those of people who witnessed the events firsthand. We don't just learn about the past, we can relive it at a neurological level. The Telegraph anxiety of 1858 and Internet anxiety of 1994 weren't separate phenomena. They were the same fear in a new costume, the same human brain pattern encountering psychologically equivalent stimulus, rapid, incomprehensible communication change. The terror of the 1906 earthquake survivors and 2020 pandemic victims wasn't coincidentally similar, it was neurologically consistent. The revolutionary rage of the 1834 mill workers and 2019 climate activists wasn't inspired by historical example, it was the same neural pathway activating in response to perceived injustice and systemic failure. We are not individuals learning from history. We are patterned minds with predictable response patterns to specific stimuli. And the final question is whether consciousness itself, our ability to recognize these patterns, is enough to break free from the cycle.
In recent years, archaeologist Dr. Sarah Parcak has published satellite research revealing patterns consistent with a stark historical truth. Civilizations that survived major transitions weren't the ones that avoided repeating history. They were the ones that recognized the patterns and consciously chose different responses. The ancient cities that anticipated drought cycles based on previous generations' experiences built the aqueducts that saved them. The ones that ignored those patterns are now ruins beneath the sand, visible only from space. For the first time in human history, we possess both the neurological evidence of our repetitive nature and the technological tools to intervene in our own pattern recognition. The question is whether we have the courage to use them. The breakthrough comes from understanding that awareness itself is intervention. Studies in neuroscience and psychology over the past decade have demonstrated that when people study detailed accounts of past crises before encountering analogous modern scenarios, their decision-making patterns shift measurably. Studies suggest that medical students who studied historical pandemic responses made significantly different triage decisions than those who didn't. Not better or worse, but different, breaking the automatic pattern. We can, it turns out, rewire our collective responses, but only through conscious, deliberate engagement with historical parallels. The parallel lives aren't a prison sentence, they're a warning system, if we're willing to listen. The evidence from our parallel lives isn't a curse, it's a compass. The Telegraph and Internet anxieties teach us that technological disruption always triggers psychologically equivalent fears, but societies that created regulatory frameworks and digital literacy programs early, like Estonia's e-government initiatives launched in cramped post-Soviet offices in the late 1990s, or Singapore's Smart Nation program, developed after witnessing other nations' digital chaos, navigated these transitions with measurably less social fracture than nations that dismissed the concerns as mere technophobia. They didn't avoid the pattern, they anticipated it and prepared. The 1906 earthquake and 2020 pandemic show us that disaster euphoria inevitably fades into scapegoating, but cities like Tokyo and nations like New Zealand that built institutional memory of crisis psychology into their emergency response protocols saw measurably less community fragmentation. They studied how humans behave under existential threat and designed systems that channeled those predictable responses toward resilience rather than blame. A disaster preparedness official in Tokyo explained, "We study how people failed before so we can succeed differently." The revolutionary parallels reveal the most profound truth.
The mill workers of 1834 won their 10-hour workday by 1847, but it took 13 years of relentless pressure and countless setbacks. The climate activists of 2019 are living through their own timeline of frustration and incremental progress. Knowing this doesn't diminish their struggle, it contextualizes it, makes it bearable, proves that systemic change operates on generational timescales that feel agonizingly slow to individuals, but remain remarkably consistent across history. Every major social transformation follows this pattern. We are hardwired for repetition, yes, but we are also capable of metacognition, of observing our own patterns and choosing differently. The parallel lives across centuries aren't evidence of futility, they're proof of consistency. And consistency means predictability, and predictability means agency. Because now that you can see the pattern, you don't get to pretend you're not inside it. If these patterns have opened your eyes, subscribe to Dark Dimensions X and hit the bell. There are more echoes waiting to be discovered, and you're already looking for them.